The Ocean Majesty was the kind of cruise liner that looked flawless in brochures. Endless decks gleaming in the sun, cascading glass elevators, and a swimming pool so blue it looked painted. On the morning of departure from Miami, the terminal buzzed with 1,000 different conversations, each voice a cocktail of accents, laughter, and excitement. Families posed for photos with the ship in the background. Lovers leaned into each other for selfies, and elderly couples clutched boarding passes like prized tickets to paradise. Among them was 28-year-old Megan Kersey, traveling alone for the first time, determined to break the monotony of her quiet office job. She booked this 7-day Caribbean cruise on impulse, chasing the promise of freedom and maybe even a little adventure. But freedom, she'd soon learn, had a different meaning on the open ocean. Once aboard, Megan felt a strange duality. The ship was enormous, yet claustrophobic in subtle ways. The hallways narrow, the cabins tucked into maze-like corridors where everything smelled faintly of disinfectant and salt. Crew members moved with uncanny synchronization, their smiles rehearsed and unwavering. Megan's stateroom was on Deck 7, midship, a modest room with a single bed, a porthole view of the port city shrinking in the distance, and a bathroom so compact she could reach the sink while standing in the shower. She unpacked slowly, trying to ignore the sudden pang of isolation as the departure horn blasted, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate through her ribs by nightfall. The ship was far from shore, and the horizon melted into inky blackness. Megan wandered into the observation lounge, where soft jazz spilled from hidden speakers and the low lighting made everything feel intimate. She sipped a mojito and watched the waves churn in the moonlight. That's when she first noticed him, a tall man in a dark suit, standing alone near the far window. He wasn't looking at the sea or the other passengers. He was looking at her. His expression didn't shift when she met his gaze. It wasn't curiosity or flirtation. It was something heavier, more intent, like he was studying her. Before she could decide whether to approach or leave, a couple passed between them, and when they cleared the space, he was gone. Later that night, unable to sleep, Megan took a walk along Deck 7's exterior walkway. The air was sharp and briny, the only sounds the hum of the engines and the hiss of water against the hull. The walkway was empty, or so she thought, until she caught movement in the corner of her eye. A figure stood just at the edge of her peripheral vision, far down the walkway. The dim safety lights traced his outline, but when she blinked, he was gone again, as if the shadows themselves had swallowed him. She quickened her pace back to her cabin, her pulse thudding in her ears. She didn't see the man again before falling asleep, but in the early hours of the morning, she woke to a sound, a slow, deliberate knock on her cabin door. It came 3 times, spaced evenly, almost politely. She sat up, heart hammering, listening to the silence that followed. No footsteps retreated, no voices lingered in the hall. Just the steady, muffled churn of the ship as it carried her further into open water. The next morning, Megan convinced herself she'd overreacted. Cruises had security cameras, trained staff, and plenty of people around. Surely she wasn't in any real danger. Still, as she made her way to the breakfast buffet, she couldn't shake the memory of the slow, deliberate knock on her door. The corridor outside her cabin seemed longer than usual, lined with identical doors that gave no hint of the people behind them. Two uniformed crew members passed her, speaking softly in a language she didn't recognize. As they walked by, she noticed one of them glancing over his shoulder at her. Not just a quick glance, but a long, assessing look, as though measuring her reaction. Breakfast should have been a comfort. Sunlight pouring through panoramic windows, the clatter of plates, the smell of coffee and fresh pastries. But Megan's attention kept snagging on small details. A waiter refilling water glasses seemed to be lingering at her table just a bit too long. A young couple at the next table whispered rapidly to each other and kept glancing toward the entrance. And when she finally stood to leave, she caught sight of the man from the night before, the one in the dark suit, seated alone near the back. His hands were folded neatly on the table, his plate untouched. He didn't blink when their eyes met. This time, Megan didn't wait to see if he would vanish. She turned and left. She decided decided to spend the afternoon exploring the ship. Deck 7 had several quiet lounges and a library that smelled faintly of old paper despite the ocean air. In the library, she struck up a brief conversation with an older British woman named Helen, who was knitting in the corner. When Megan mentioned seeing a man in a dark suit, Helen's needles paused mid-click. Tall, thin, doesn't eat. Helen asked, her voice low. I've seen him too. 3 years ago, on this very ship. Different cruise. He was watching people then as well. Before Megan could ask more, another passenger entered, and Helen's demeanor instantly brightened, as if she hadn't said anything at all. That evening, Megan noticed a change in the ship's atmosphere. The wind picked up, rattling the glass doors on the outer decks. The hallways seemed dimmer, shadows stretching farther than they should. She passed the security camera mounted above the stairwell, and had the sudden, irrational feeling that it wasn't connected to anything at all. Back in her cabin, she locked the door and tried to distract herself with a movie on a tiny wall-mounted TV. Halfway through, the screen flickered, briefly showing what looked like live footage of the ship's exterior decks at night. In the grainy image, a lone figure stood at the railing, unmoving, staring out at the sea. She shut off the TV, her heart pounding. The ship's engines throbbed beneath her feet, steady and relentless. But she couldn't shake the growing sense that the Ocean Majesty wasn't just carrying her across the Caribbean. It was carrying something else, something that didn't belong among the living. Megan woke in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Slow, measured, unhurried. She stayed still, listening. The sound didn't pass her door. It stopped in front of it. She counted to 10 in her head, barely breathing. Then, instead of a knock, she heard a faint scraping noise, like something being dragged gently across her doorframe. When she finally gathered the courage to look through the peephole, her stomach knotted. The tall man in the dark suit was standing there, his back to her, facing the opposite wall. He wasn't moving. After several seconds, he tilted his head ever so slightly, not toward the corridor, but toward the door, as if he knew she was watching. The next morning, she decided she had to confront him. Waiting until the decks were busy with passengers lounging and swimming, Megan wandered the ship until she spotted him at last, standing alone at the portside railing, gazing at the sea. From this close, she noticed details she hadn't before. His skin was pale in a way that didn't seem natural, and his dark suit appeared slightly outdated, the cut and stitching something she'd expect to see in old photographs. "Can I help you?" she asked, forcing her voice to stay even. He turned his head slowly, his expression unreadable, his eyes an unsettling shade of gray that seemed almost colorless in the daylight. For a moment, he didn't speak. The sounds of the ship, distant laughter, the thrum of engines, the splash of water in the pool, seemed to fade until there was only the rush of the wind and the relentless crash of waves below. When he finally answered, his voice was calm, deep, and strangely precise. "You're in my cabin," he said. Megan felt a chill run through her despite the warm sun on her skin. "What are you talking about?" she asked. He didn't respond, just turned back toward the horizon. "Your cabin," he repeated, "is mine." Then he stepped away, disappearing into the crowd with unnatural smoothness, leaving her rooted to the spot. Shaken, Megan went to the front desk to ask about her cabin's history. The receptionist, a young man with a clipped accent, tapped at his keyboard before frowning. "Cabin 743?" he asked. "That cabin isn't." He stopped himself, his eyes flicking up to meet hers. "Never mind. Everything's fine," he said quickly, his forced smile not reaching his eyes. "Is there anything else I can help you with?" When she pressed for more information, he excused himself and stepped into the staff-only door behind the desk, leaving her standing there with her unanswered questions. That night, Megan dreamed she was floating just above the black surface of the sea, looking down at the Ocean Majesty as it cut through the water. On the upper deck, the man in the suit stood at the railing, watching her. His face was perfectly still, but in the reflection of the water below, his mouth was open wide in a silent scream. The morning after the dream, Megan woke with the uneasy sensation that her room was smaller than it had been before, the walls just a fraction closer. Her porthole window, usually streaked with spray, was perfectly clean, so clean it reflected her face like a mirror. When she looked into it, for the briefest second, she thought she saw someone standing directly behind her. She spun around, but the cabin was empty. Her unease grew heavier by the hour. She couldn't shake the man's words from the previous day. "You're in my cabin." Determined to learn the truth, she sought out Helen in the library. The older woman's knitting needles clicked rapidly as Megan asked if she knew anything about Cabin 743. Helen hesitated before lowering her voice. "There are stories," she said. "A man died in that room. Some say he jumped from the deck. Others say he never left at all." Megan pressed her for details, but Helen only shook her head. "The crew won't talk about it. Not officially. They scrub the passenger lists every year, but sometimes things slip through." She slid a folded piece of paper across the table. "I kept this from a cruise years ago. Same ship. Look at the names." When Megan unfolded the paper, her stomach tightened. It was a photocopy of an old passenger list, dated exactly 3 years prior. Most of the names were blurred from the copy, but one stood out in sharp, bold print. Daniel Crowe, Cabin 743. In the column marked Disembarked, his entry was blank. Megan ran her finger down the list twice, hoping she'd missed it, but there was no departure record. When she looked up, Helen's eyes were glassy. "He never checked out," Helen whispered. "And neither did the girl who had that room before you." That night, as the ship rocked gently on the dark water, an announcement blared over the intercom, the kind that instantly quieted every conversation on board. "Attention all passengers. If anyone has seen Ms. Laura Bennett, please contact guest services immediately." Murmurs swept through the hallways. Megan didn't know the name, but her chest tightened anyway. Later, she overheard 2 crew members whispering near the stairwell. "She was last seen near the aft deck," one said. "Security says the cameras glitched again." The other just muttered, "It's happening again." Before walking off quickly, in the early hours of the morning, Megan awoke to the sensation of the mattress shifting, as if someone had just sat down beside her. She kept her eyes closed, paralyzed, every muscle rigid. A moment later, a cold fingertip brushed her wrist, and a man's voice whispered near her ear, "You need to leave." The morning after the whisper in her cabin, Megan felt raw and brittle, like her nerves had been pulled taut. She couldn't sit still. The ocean outside looked different too, not serene and endless like before, but vast and threatening, a living thing with its own agenda. She decided to walk the ship just to keep herself moving. It was on the aft deck, where the stern cut through the foaming wake, that she first noticed the crowd. Passengers were gathered at the railing, murmuring, pointing toward the water. Crew members moved among them, trying to disperse the group, their polite smiles too tight to be genuine. Megan squeezed forward, and the murmurs fell away into silence. There, bobbing in the churn of the wake, was a bright red scarf, twisting and sinking in the foam. It took her a moment to realize she'd seen that scarf before, around the neck of a young woman she'd passed the day before near the buffet. Megan's stomach dropped. A crewman quickly hauled the scarf up with a hooked pole and stuffed it into a plastic evidence bag. No one said the words aloud, but every passenger there knew what it meant. Someone had gone overboard. Again, a voice behind her said quietly, "They won't find her." Megan turned sharply. It was Helen, her knitting absent today, her expression grim. "The ship never stops long enough," Helen continued. "By the time they report it, the current has her. Same every time. And if it's who I think it is, she was in cabin 729, 2 doors down from yours." Megan felt a cold weight settle in her chest. She glanced toward the nearest security camera. Its red indicator light was off. That night, Megan returned to her cabin to find her door slightly ajar. She was certain she'd locked it. Inside, the room smelled faintly of seawater, sharp and metallic. Her suitcase had been pulled from under the bed, and her clothes were neatly folded on the desk, except for her own scarf, which was missing. She searched every corner of the room, her pulse quickening. Then she saw it. Resting on the porthole's interior ledge, a single wet footprint, too large to be hers. Unable to stay in the cabin, Megan wandered the decks until she found herself back at the aft railing. The night air was heavy, the ship's wake stretching out in a silver ribbon under the moon. She was about to turn away when she saw movement in the water. Not a shape exactly, but a disruption, like something rising just beneath the surface, pacing the ship as it moved. The water broke for a split second, and she caught a pale face looking up at her from the depths. The eyes were the same lifeless gray as the man in the suit. The next morning, the Ocean Majesty felt quieter. Conversations in the dining room were hushed. eyes darting toward the windows that overlooked the water. The official announcement about the missing passenger was clinical and rehearsed. Despite an extensive search, Ms. Laura Bennett has not been located. Our thoughts are with her loved ones during this difficult time. No mention of how she'd gone overboard. No details, no explanations. Megan's table mates exchanged uneasy glances before changing the subject entirely, as though speaking of it too long might invite the same fate. Megan decided she couldn't let it go. She went down to guest services again, demanding to speak to the ship's security officer. The receptionist, the same young man as before, tried to placate her with polite deflections, but this time she refused to leave. After several tense minutes, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a crisp white uniform appeared. His name tag read Chief Security Officer Markham. He led her into a small, windowless office and shut the door. "You should drop this," he said immediately. His tone wasn't threatening. It was weary, almost resigned. When Megan asked why, he sighed and leaned in. "You've seen him, haven't you?" The man in the suit. Markham's expression didn't change when she nodded. "He's been on this ship longer than anyone can prove. We've checked manifests going back 15 years. Every time a passenger in a certain section of Deck 7 vanishes, there are reports of him. Always the same description. Always near the victim's cabin. And it's never random." Megan felt her mouth go dry. "Then why not lock that section? Warn people." Markham looked away. "Orders from above. And sometimes the disappearances stop for months. We don't want panic." His voice dropped even lower. But the moment he starts watching someone, it's already too late. Before she could press him for more, a sharp knock rattled the office door. Another officer stepped in, whispering something into Markham's ear. His face drained of color. "Stay in your cabin tonight," he told Megan urgently. "Lock the door. Don't answer for anyone." He hesitated, then added, "If you hear the knock, it means he's already chosen you." Back in her cabin, Megan locked the door, shoved a chair under the handle, and sat on the bed with every light on. Hours passed. The ship groaned and shifted under the weight of the sea. Just as she started to think she might make it through the night, she heard it. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Exactly like before. But this time, the voice that followed wasn't the man's deep monotone. It was her own voice, perfect in tone and pitch, calling softly, "Megan, let me in." Megan didn't sleep after the voice at her door. By sunrise, she felt feverish, her thoughts sharp but restless, like her brain was running on adrenaline alone. She knew if she stayed in that cabin one more night, she might not wake up at all. Markham's warning replayed in her head. If you hear the knock, it means he's already chosen you. That meant the only way out was to get ahead of him. Or it. She dressed quickly, packed a small bag, and left before most passengers were awake, determined to find whatever the crew was hiding. Her first stop was the library. Helen was there again, knitting, but when Megan sat across from her and whispered, "I'm going to find out what happened to Daniel Crowe," the needles froze midair. "You're going to get yourself killed," Helen said flatly. But then she reached into her bag and handed Megan a laminated card. It was an old crew access badge, the kind with a magnetic strip and the faded logo of the Ocean Majesty from years ago. "You didn't get this from me," Helen said, her eyes never meeting Megan's. "If you're going to look, start below Deck 2. That's where they keep the old records." Getting to Deck 2 wasn't easy. Most stairwells were guarded, and the elevators required a keycard for restricted floors. Megan shadowed a pair of crew members until they unlocked a maintenance door, slipping in behind them just before it closed. The air was cooler down here, and the hum of the engines was louder, deeper, like a pulse. The corridors were narrow, with exposed pipes overhead and peeling safety posters on the walls. A faded sign read Archives, crew only. Inside the archives, rows of metal filing cabinets lined the room. Dust coated everything, as if no one had been down there in years. Megan started pulling drawers open, scanning through brittle passenger manifests and yellowed incident reports. That's when she found it. A folder labeled Crowe, Daniel, 1998. Inside was a black and white photograph of a man in a dark suit, his eyes the same pale gray she'd seen on deck. The report listed his cause of death as presumed overboard, body not recovered. But the notes below were more disturbing. Multiple passenger disappearances associated with cabin 743, dating prior to and after Crowe's voyage. Recommend sealing cabin. The final line was scrawled in red ink. This will not stop him. She was still holding the folder when a metallic bang echoed down the corridor. Footsteps followed, slow, deliberate, and getting closer. The lights flickered once, then again. Megan shoved the folder into her bag and ducked into a side storage room, pressing her ear to the door. The footsteps stopped just outside. She could hear the faint creak of leather shoes shifting on the floor, and then the sound of knuckles brushing gently against the door. 3 times. The footsteps lingered outside the storage room for what felt like an eternity before fading into the distance. Megan waited several minutes longer, her breath shallow, before slipping out and heading deeper into the archives. She had to know more. The folder hinted at something, but she needed proof. In the far corner of the room, half hidden behind a fallen shelving unit, she found a locked cabinet. The badge Helen had given her didn't work, but a quick yank on the warped metal hinge snapped it open. Inside were a dozen old VHS tapes, each labeled with a date and the words security footage, Deck 7. She carried one to the nearest maintenance office, where an old TV with a built-in VCR sat in the corner. The grainy footage showed familiar hallways, passengers strolling past. Hours ticked by on the timestamp until, at 2:43 a.m., the feed caught a tall, thin man in a dark suit standing motionless outside a cabin door. He didn't knock. He didn't move. He simply waited. Minutes passed, then hours. Other passengers walked by without seeing him at all, stepping within inches of his figure as if he were invisible. At 4:17 a.m., the door opened, and a woman stepped out in her nightclothes, eyes unfocused. She walked calmly beside him down the hallway, out of frame. The footage ended there. Megan's stomach turned. It wasn't just that Daniel Crowe appeared. It was the way the passengers followed him, willingly, almost peacefully. She pulled another tape, this one from 2004, and saw the same thing happen again. A different victim, a different cabin, the same lifeless expression. Some never even closed their doors. They just left with him. She replayed the clip, watching carefully, and noticed something worse. Each time the victim's reflection passed a porthole or a polished surface, it wasn't their own face staring back. It was his. A voice broke her trance. You weren't supposed to see that. Megan spun around to find Chief Security Officer Markham standing in the doorway, his face grim. You don't understand what he is, he said. He's not a ghost, not the way people think. He's part of the ship now. Like the rust, like the engines. Wherever the Ocean Majesty goes, he goes. And when he chooses someone, they don't fight. They can't. It's like he rewrites them. Megan demanded to know why no one tried to stop him. Markham's answer was barely above a whisper. Because if you block him, he takes someone else instead. Sometimes more than one. The floor vibrated suddenly, a low rumble that made the light fixtures sway. Markham froze, listening. That's him, he said, his eyes wide. He's moving now. And if he's moving in the middle of the day, it means he's in a hurry. He stepped aside, his voice sharp. If you want to live, you get off this ship before nightfall. Even if it's not at port. Megan didn't wait for another explanation. Markham's warning was still ringing in her ears as she stuffed the Crowe, Daniel folder into her bag and bolted from the archives. The corridors below Deck 2 felt tighter now, the air thicker, as though the ship itself was holding its breath. She made for the maintenance stairs, but halfway up, she froze. At the far end of the passage, Daniel stood, one hand resting lightly on the wall, his head tilted as though he could hear her thoughts. He didn't run. He didn't need to. With each step she took backward, he took one forward. The same slow, deliberate pace that had haunted her nights. She spun into a service hallway, her shoes slapping against the metal floor, heartbeat loud in her ears. The ship's layout was a labyrinth, and every turn seemed to lead her deeper into unfamiliar territory. Pipes rattled overhead. Somewhere above, music from the passenger decks filtered faintly down, cheerful and grotesquely out of place. She ducked into a laundry room, slamming the door and leaning against it. Her breath fogged the cold air. Through the small window in the door, she saw him pass by, not walking, but gliding, his shoes barely making contact with the floor. When the coast was clear, she crept out, aiming for the lifeboat deck. The emergency exit sign's green glow was a beacon, pulling her forward. But as she neared the outer hatch, 2 crew members stepped into her path. They didn't look angry. They looked terrified. You can't go out there, one whispered. If you try to leave when he's marked you, he'll just follow. And then he'll take more than just you. Megan shook her head, trying to push past, but the other crew member grabbed her arm. Please, he said, don't make him angry. A loud metallic groan reverberated through the hall. The green exit light flickered and died. Behind her, the hallway grew darker, shadows stretching unnaturally long. When she turned, Daniel was there, closer than she'd ever seen him. His suit was immaculate, but water dripped steadily from his cuffs. His pale eyes locked on hers, and for the first time, he smiled. It wasn't warm. It wasn't even human. The crew members scattered instantly, disappearing into side corridors, leaving her alone. The ship lurched suddenly, throwing her against the wall. The overhead lights strobed once, twice, and when they steadied, Daniel was gone. But in his place, resting neatly on the floor where he'd stood, was her missing scarf, still wet, smelling faintly of salt and something metallic. By nightfall, the Ocean Majesty had become a different ship. The lively music, the chatter of passengers, the clinking of glasses, all of it felt like it belonged to another world. Megan could barely hear it over the pounding of her own heartbeat. She kept to the outer decks, scanning for lifeboats, even as Markham's warning replayed in her mind. If you block him, he takes someone else instead. Every shadow felt alive now. Every reflection in the glass made her flinch. Helen found her on the starboard promenade, her knitting bag gone for the first time. If you want to live, she said without preamble, you have to give him something he wants more than you. Megan's first instinct was to say she had nothing, no bargaining chip. But Helen's look was hard, unflinching. That's not true. He doesn't take people at random. He takes people who are untethered. Alone. Her voice broke slightly. That's why I've never left the ship. Megan understood then. Helen had been avoiding disembarkation for years, living in the belly of the Ocean Majesty so Daniel wouldn't choose someone else in her place. The wind whipped across the deck as Megan considered her only option. If she stayed hidden, someone else, maybe Helen, maybe a stranger, would vanish tonight. If she faced him, she might end up like the others, or she might find a way to end this. The moon broke through the clouds, painting the deck in silver. And there he was, by the aft railing, waiting. He didn't move as she approached, but his head tilted in that unsettling way, like he was listening to something only he could hear. You don't have to take anyone else, she said, voice trembling but clear. Just take me. His pale eyes locked on hers. For a long moment, the ship seemed to hold its breath. Then he extended one hand, palm up. The air grew colder, the sound of the engines fading to nothing. Megan stepped forward, and her fingers touched his. A wave of freezing water seemed to rush through her veins. The deck tilted under her feet, the world going dark, and then she was standing on the surface of the ocean itself, the Ocean Majesty gliding silently away in the distance. Daniel stood beside her, his expression unreadable. When she woke, she was in a hospital bed, sunlight streaming through the window. A nurse explained she'd been found floating in a life vest by a fishing vessel 2 days ago. Lucky to be alive, the woman said. Megan tried to speak, but her throat felt raw. In the corner of the room, a man in a dark suit stood watching. He didn't move. He didn't blink. And no one else seemed to notice him.